This is a Media Lab podcast.
What do you think about this here, Dave?
I don't know. Is that skin? What are we looking at?
I'm trying to show you my chest hair.
Oh,
okay.
Wow. There.
What do you think? Is it enough? Too much? Not enough? I don't know.
No,
I'm trying to up my online dating game here, and I'm thinking, through no, serendipity of what we're going to be talking about here today, I'm thinking that this might seduce someone, or my hope is everyone, but I don't know. What does this do for you?
it's going to work really, really well for you. I think that it will work well.
Why can't you look at me in the eyes?
In his own garage, Kyle has built a machine, cobbled together with parts found in his friend's church basement and a dumpster behind the local Dairy Queen. This monstrosity is now alive and evil. Kyle has convinced his friend Dave to help stop the apocalypse by reviewing films the machine picks. The ultimate purpose is still unknown, and Kyle could have probably done this himself, but he's not being dragged to hell alone. This is Kyle and Dave versus the machine.
Welcome to Kyle and Dave versus the Machine. My name is Kyle.
I am Dave.
And I'm the machine.
A podcast where a sentient machine forces us to watch movies in order to prevent it from initiating the apocalypse. Although we do tend to talk about the ideas of the movie rather than the movie itself. Today, we're going to be watching the film, The World Is Not Enough.
As the countdown begins to the 21st century, it's good to know there is still one number you can always count on.
Bond.
Bond.
Can't you just say hello like a normal person?
Renard is behind this.
He will die along with everyone in the city.
We do not negotiate with terrorists.
His only goal is chaos.
I sent 009 to kill Reynard. He put a bullet in his head. That bullet's still there.
He feels no pain. He can push himself harder, longer than any normal man.
No hard feelings, Mr. Bond.
It appears that...
Okay, Dave, I'm really excited to understand what you think about this film. And, look, someone's knocking at our guest door here.
Again.
Let me just open this up. Kyle Turner, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I just appreciate that people just walk through these flying doors that appear in their lives and have no qualms just walking into really a surprise each and every time.
Yeah, back in Connecticut, no one locks their door, so you can just literally open it up.
Oh, apparently Canada is just a big Connecticut, Dave.
Well,
that's fun to know.
I did leave Toronto for that reason. I missed that. Although I don't think Calgary keeps their doors open anymore.
It's too cold. I think, Kyle, what needs to happen before we jump into talking about anything is maybe you can describe a little bit about who you are and what you do.
My name is Kyle Turner, and I am a freelance film critic and writer, primarily of film and culture. And I have a special interest in the James Bond franchise and queer cinema and sort of the intersections of gender and cinema and representation and whatnot.
That's a good jumping off point here. I want us all to answer this, but I guess what is your relationship with just the Bond franchise, kind of in general? Like, why did you come to this? Why is this a fascination of yours?
That's a good question. I initially was introduced to the Bond franchise by my babysitters when I was 6 or 7, and they had me play GoldenEye N64, and then they showed me, I think, Goldfinger, and I begged my mother at Walmart to buy me Dr. No on DVD, and the rest was history. And so I continued watching them when they were on TV, and I saw Casino Royale, which was my first Bond film in theaters when I was 12, I think. And then as I've continued to grow and become more aware of its history and its cultural implications, I've become really fascinated with James Bond as like a really rich text to explore geopolitics, to explore representations of gender and masculinity, to explore the way in which the Bond franchise is reactionary, not only in terms of sociocultural or sociopolitical movements, but also in cinematic movements, because like you wouldn't have Moonraker if you didn't have Star Wars, and you wouldn't have Live and Let Die if you didn't have like the entire blaxploitation cinema. So I think, in spite of its regressive politics, I think even in its regression, I think they end up being really, really fascinating texts that have morphed its own ideas in respect to the culture at large.
I know that is sometimes a criticism of the Bond films. I don't know if you have a perspective on this, of how they very rarely are like pushing film or the genre forward. They're kind of always responding to what's going on in the culture. I don't know if that's necessarily something that you agree with.
I don't know if I agree with that, because the initial creation of James Bond was very much born of a particular idea of like Western white heteromasculinity and its containment within a certain genre. And then its expansion into film has always necessarily been reactionary. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. And I think I would argue that if they're not necessarily pushing the genre as far as it can go formally, I think it is interrogating some really interesting things in terms of genre, mythology, and masculinity. Like, my theory is that the Daniel Craig cycle specifically is indicative of this post 9/11 construction of masculinity that is fundamentally broken, and that it is responding to a lot of post 9/11 cinema, including, but not limited to, the Bourne series, but also like In the Valley of Allah.
Yeah, definitely. You can definitely see the change that happened to the James Bond franchise post 9/11, I think. And in many ways, I think you can, not that we've seen the movie yet, but you can see in The World Is Not Enough how it is a very pre-9/11 movie in many ways.
Absolutely. I think they would actually make a really good double feature in that way.
Sure. Dave, why don't you talk about your history with the Bond franchise?
Okay. I watched them. They are.
What was your first? Do you remember your first James Bond movie?
Pretty personal. Christ. Do you have a couch for me to sit on? Do I take notes? Fucking psychology. No. I don't remember. On TV, it was probably a Roger Moore one, because I think in the 80s, that's what was on TV. So if I had to throw out a name, it might be Moonraker or something like that. I think, what's Timothy Dalton? Late 80s,
Living
early
Daylights?
90s. Yeah, so Living Daylights came out, and I might have been, what's Living Days, 1988?
85.
85. Oh, shit. No, I'm still...
Oh, no, 87, because License to Kill was 89.
89. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, no, that definitely wouldn't have been a theater movie. I was still 10 something. So, probably Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton. I remember not liking Timothy Dalton. I remember being part of, as a kid, this media questioning why Pierce Brosnan didn't get the role earlier.
Right.
But, I didn't really understand what that meant, because I was still pretty young. And I think I got back to the Sean Connery originals later, probably in my teens. Yeah.
Would you have then watched the Pierce Brosnan ones in theaters?
Yes.
Like, was that okay.
Yeah, GoldenEye.
So he was kind of your first, like, cinema, like, going to the movies Bond.
Yeah, GoldenEye was my first in the theater Bond. And that whole cultural phenomena that came out of that one movie was part of my childhood. Yeah, I mean, Kyle brought up the video game. That's a fundamentally powerful experience for people of my era, and it's weird in retrospect.
It's still literally referenced today.
Yeah.
Like I can't believe like the staying power of that one video game.
I feel like it's kind of like a couple of those classics. I'm pretty sure I read that there are still tournaments and stuff. I mean, there's no way that game holds up in any way, shape, or form.
Oh no,
but
the graphics are awful. But
it's like a polygon. No, it's not Doom, but and then Daniel Craig's my man. My Casino Royale was amazing. Skyfall's amazing. Everything. I don't know. I watched Quantum of Solace.
Yeah.
And
I mean, yeah.
It was the one after that. Is that Skyfall after? No.
Yeah.
Spectre was the last one.
Spectre's
terrible.
Wrong. Sorry.
Oh wow, we're gonna get into a fight.
I will tell you this though. I know a lot of people get down on Quantum of Solace, which I think as a film might not work, but if you watch it like really close to Casino Royale, it kind of does.
I was
work,
just gonna say,
opinion.
yeah, we did a marathon and it was much better in a row. But waiting 3 years and then watching it on its own, it was disjointed. It was kind of hard to digest?
So James Bond for me, it's a weird history because unlike you, Dave, I was, I guess, not seeing these late night James Bond movies. I knew of the character. The first time I saw James Bond is because on the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, I would have been 12 or 13 at the time. They did this summer series. They showed the very first 6 Sean Connery films on successive Saturdays for 6 weeks. So I basically watched all of them. I think except for Thunderball. I think that was the one I missed. Anyways, I watched all the other ones. So that was my first introduction to James Bond, was watching Sean Connery, so the original. And I loved it. Like, for whatever reason, it just like flipped this switch in my brain. It was like, this is cool. And like, he's being cool. And that's pretty misogynistic, but you know, it's still kind of fun because I am watching this. Then the next time I saw James Bond was the last Pierce Brosnan film, which was Die Another Day. Is that correct? Die Another Day?
Madonna's song? Yeah.
The Madonna one, yeah. So I saw that in university with friends, and that was the very first James Bond movie I saw in theaters. I also do, that was like my concept of what James Bond was. And then of course Daniel Craig came, kind of revolutionized it. And then a couple years after that, after Casino Royale, I do these challenges for myself every so often, and it's like, okay, I'm going to watch every Godzilla film ever made, and then I do it. Or it's like, whatever. Right now, I'm trying to persevere and watch the last 4 of the Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th movies. Most of them are awful. So I make these little challenges for myself. And one of them was, I'm going to watch every James Bond film. So I watched every James Bond film, and that's where I got kind of this appreciation for it. It was nice revisiting things and seeing these ones. This is why I have the very unpopular opinion of like my list of favorite Bonds, because no one ever agrees with me, because I don't think Timothy Dalton is bad. And
no,
so
he's
you can
great.
sue me.
He's great.
Yeah. And everyone says that he's the worst. I'm like, I disagree very strongly that he's the worst Bond.
He's a proto Daniel Craig.
He is. Thank you. I say this all the time. It's like, he's Daniel Craig before Daniel Craig.
They weren't ready for him.
I'm beginning to understand why there are 2 Kyles on this episode.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe that's true.
It's quite a lot of, yeah. All right, keep going.
And
keep
so,
going.
And so that's basically my history of Bond. I love this franchise. I connect deeply with a lot of the films. But I do love the Daniel Craig stuff. I really do. I think it's a very different type of Bond than what came before it. But I also think that it kind of needed to change to update itself. And I think this is part of the reason, while people are kind of like in the middle with Pierce Brosnan a lot of the time, is because they were trying to figure it out. Like, this is a franchise at that point that had been 30 something years. And people were starting to see like the cracks, whether it was, we talked about this in our Austin Powers episode, right? Where it's like, people were starting to see like, this doesn't really hold up anymore. And unfortunately, I think Pierce Brosnan drew the short stick, because I will say this, I do not think, and I'll now throw it over to you both to debate this, but I actually don't think Pierce Brosnan is a bad Bond. I just think he has a lot of bad films that he was in. He's let down by the material that was given to him, but I think he himself is actually pretty good. So it's unfortunate, because I also love GoldenEye, but I'm not like the biggest fan of the next 3 that he did for varying levels and reasons and stuff. How about you, Kyle, about just Pierce Brosnan in general? How do you feel like his tenure as James Bond was?
That makes sense. I think I agree with your assessment that he's a fine Bond that's let down by the material, but I also don't think the material is necessarily that bad. I think maybe he's just the wrong Bond for what they were trying to do, because his tenure is very much a tenure of a James Bond in transition, because he's stuck between the fall of the Soviet Union, fall of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Cold War, and 9/11. Not to say that there weren't things happening geopolitically or socially or culturally in between that time, but I think the filmmakers were trying to figure out like how exactly could Bond respond to what was going on, when what was going on was not necessarily as like headline grabbing, or did not necessarily serve as good of a base or structure in which to build films off of. With that being said, I think what will end up be interesting about this conversation is that I think there is a lot of richness, and there's a lot of potential richness for this material. And I think GoldenEye is like one of the best films of the 90s of all time, because you have this figure who is called out by M as a sexist, misogynist dinosaur and a relic of the Cold War. He is very much embedded in a very specific time frame and like social and political context. And now he feels almost displaced, and that displacement forces him to confront these like political ghosts.
How about you, Dave? Like, what is your opinion of Pierce Brosnan's tenure as Bond?
Just listening to you, Kyle Turner, I don't know if I understand it the way you do. I mean, number one, when these movies are being made, there is no 9/11. So they're swimming in this little bit of a weird world where, as you brought up, GoldenEye was kind of a Casino Royale. It was a reboot. They shook things up, and then they immediately went back to make 3 shit movies. They literally shit the bed. I couldn't comprehend what growing up and what going to the theaters, like this one in particular and the one after, I did not go to the theater to watch. After they wasted Michelle Yeoh and is it Jonathan Pryce? It's a fucking terrible movie. Which one's it?
That's
Die Another Day? No.
Tomorrow Never Dies.
Tomorrow Never Dies. Everybody's dying somewhere. But anyways, Tomorrow Never Dies. And I was profoundly disappointed with that. I mean, Michelle Yeoh's star was starting to rise, and I got excited about that, and that was awful. And then this one, as Kyle and I have discussed, I am not a Denise Richards fan. I will say that Drop Dead Gorgeous was a surprising role for me, because she was actually herself in it. But, so it wasn't a draw. I didn't really want to see it. I liked Robert Carlyle, but I think I watched this on video, I'm pretty sure. I think I went to see the theater for the Madonna one, but the song's terrible. So, I didn't understand the context.
Wait, are you saying the garbage song is terrible?
No, I was talking about Madonna's song.
Okay.
The garbage song's pretty good, except, so I was telling Kyle, I'm such a 90s person, because I knew it was garbage as soon as she started singing, but it's not garbage because it's written by some Bond music score person. It's got that 60s, right? Kitschy kind of tone, doesn't it? With the orchestral music in the background. And if you liked garbage, it's kind of a sellout, because they didn't give a fuck about any of that stuff. I mean, she was singing about killing herself half the time, so it was an interesting thing.
I don't know, not to gang up on you, Dave. To Kyle's point, though, I think that there is something to be said about how Bond did change fundamentally when the Berlin Wall fell down, because there wasn't like a distinct like enemy anymore.
Right,
I think that's the weirdness of the 90s of being like, well, who's our enemy now? Like the 80s had such as great, like every Russian was your enemy. And like for the last 15, 20 years, it's been like every Middle Eastern person is your enemy just because that's who we're at war with. And the 90s was this one time was like, we don't know. I guess our enemy is America, because that's when you started to see everyone being like upset by and like, grunge culture and that whole thing. So I think there's something to that.
Well, I mean, Daniel Craig's movies turned away from that after Casino Royale, number one. I mean, they weren't interested in pushing the sort of Islamic terrorist motif very strongly. The second one is about water. The third one's about Javier Bardem, and we're not even sure what he is. He's sort of like a Latin British agent
Joker.
who lives in Hong Kong. Like he's not meant to represent a specific threat in the same way that the Cold War kind of framed things. And Inspector, I don't know.
I think what that shows you is that as James Bond gets further away in proximity from the Cold War, James Bond's own obsolescence becomes the focus. And like James Bond himself, or sort of the specter, as it were, of British imperialism and of like cyber terrorism, and these like broader cultural, broader like governmental and political institutions, they become the enemy. And I think that's even hinted at in The World Is Not Enough.
Yeah, let's do this just so that we don't go like 30 minutes in our introduction. Let me go thank some sponsors, and then when we return, we'll be talking more about The World Is Not Enough.
Hey everyone, Kyle here again, letting you know about some of the fantastic sponsors that help make this show possible. I'm recording this at 2:30 in the morning. Why, you might ask? Mind your own business. But part of it might be that I went and saw Tenet, the first movie I have seen in a movie theater since April. No, March. But don't let the machine know, because I'm only supposed to be watching the films that they tell me to watch. And I know it's been sending out Facebook invites, so don't be a snitch. Anyways, I guess I should tell you that Kyle and Dave versus the Machine is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. The Alberta Podcast Network promotes and supports Alberta-made podcasts and connects their audiences with Alberta-based businesses and organizations. This episode of Kyle and Dave versus the Machine is brought to you by the Calgary Foundation. Whether it's funding anti-racism programs, addiction recovery, or food hampers for the hungry, for 65 years, the Calgary Foundation has proudly supported the charitable community to address some of Calgary's biggest challenges. Now, during this period of unprecedented urgent needs, Calgary Foundation renewed its commitment to building a healthy, vibrant, giving, caring, and resilient community. If you're a registered charity looking for a grant, a professional advisor creating a giving plan for your client, or a donor wanting to give back to the community, discover a wealth of resources at calgaryfoundation.org and learn more about their work through Calgary Foundation's Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. This episode is also brought to you by Park Power, a provider of electricity and natural gas in Alberta that offers low rates, awesome service, and profit sharing for local charities. In Alberta, you get to choose who to buy your energy from. Park Power has low overhead, and chances are you'll save money if you switch. You can find out how much money you could save by visiting parkpower.ca and plugging your numbers into the Alberta Energy Savings Calculator. If you decide to switch, it's easy. Nothing changes about your service, only the price you pay. Learn more at parkpower.ca.
Kyle, I know we just sat and watched this movie. I should have asked you if you even had time to sit and watch this movie with us, but you just did waste 2 hours sitting here watching.
Quarantine.
I guess so. What else are we supposed to do? Kyle, what are your just quick, brief thoughts about The World Is Not Enough?
It is much. Every time I watch it, it gets better and better, honestly. And I think it's one of the stranger Bond films where I think the plot is better than the set pieces.
I forgot how much I actually dislike the final set piece because it's filmed weird.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the director because I have no idea why they picked this director. But anyways, I'll get into that in a moment. Dave, how about yourself? Just quick tweet level of a reaction to this.
Sure, I'll go #trash. #giving my time back. #where did 2 hours of my life go? How about #what a piece of shit? We'll go there. Yeah, it was fucking terrible.
I feel like I'm going to be like in the middle of both of you because there is a lot of stuff in this movie that I think just doesn't work. Once again, though, and I think this is actually a recurring thing for Pierce Brosnan specifically, I love the introduction to this movie. I think it's phenomenal. I love the just basically the first 20 minutes of this movie, I think works supremely well. And then it kind of tries to find itself by the end of it. But I actually kind of enjoy, I guess, who you finally find out who the real villain is by the end of it. I love that little subterfuge that happens throughout the movie. Anyways, we'll get into that a little bit more.
It's a trope.
I mean, it's a very Bondy trope for sure. Would actually would come back for Skyfall again, actually, in a weird way. But
a rewrite of this, but good. Yeah.
But good. Well, same writers.
Who also wrote Johnny English. All right, sorry. Yeah,
I know.
Keep going. I apologize.
You're stepping on me. Yeah. Let's see some quick background information. So, The World Is Not Enough was released on November 19th, 1999. The only other major release that came out that week was Sleepy Hollow, written by Andrew Calvin Walker, directed by Tim Burton, starring Johnny Depp, Christina Ricci, and Miranda Richardson. That's all we need to talk about on that movie. So currently, this movie is rated 6.4 on IMDb, 57 on Metacritic, and over on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 142 critics, it's at 53%. And the users, 210,322 of them, have it at 49%. So this is considered a rotten movie per that aggregator, at least. It is available on DVD or Blu-ray. You can buy or rent it on iTunes. You can also rent it on Google Play or YouTube. And because we live in Canada, it is not available to stream anywhere, unfortunately.
It's great that we may have paid for this.
Its budget was $135 million. It opened to $35 million in North America. Domestically, it would make $126, internationally $234, which brings it up to $361 million. With inflation, that's $559. It was the 8th highest grossing film in the world in 1999. So a lot of people went and saw this movie. Its plot description is James Bond uncovers a nuclear plot while protecting an oil heiress from her former kidnapper, an international terrorist who can't feel pain. And as we kind of already mentioned, here's who it stars. Pierce Brosnan as James Bond, Robert Carlyle as Renard, Sophie Marceau as Electra King, Judi Dench as M, and Denise Richards as Dr. Christmas Jones.
Denise Richards is my favorite actress.
Anything that you want to bring up about those actors at all? Either of you, I guess?
Pierce is actually, I like Pierce as an actor. And like you guys brought up at the beginning, I don't think it's his acting that lets this Bond franchise down. He's a decent Bond. It's just too bad I just wasted 2 hours of my life watching this piece of shit that he was in. No, that's biased. Judi Dench is amazing. Apparently everything she touches blooms. So I also feel sorry that she was in this movie.
Everything that she does is good. I've seen movies that she is awful. Like the movie itself is awful.
Yeah. But she does so many. That's going to happen, right? But she's fun. And I also feel bad that she was in this movie. Luckily, she got to redeem this shitty storyline in the aforementioned Skyfall. Now I'm just being bitter.
Yeah.
And then what was the other one? Denise Richards. We know how I feel about Denise Richards.
I think, can we just get it out of the way? I just want to get this out of the way. I love the fact that she's called Dr. Christmas Jones just for this joke at the end. I think, why not?
Awful.
Why not just have her called Dr. Christmas Jones?
Well, this is the thing that upsets me the most in terms of being archaic. You know, this is a movie written by a man who lived in the 60s. You have a woman that's dressed up like 90s Lara Croft, who's supposed to be a nuclear physicist genius who's, like dismantling nuclear warheads in the middle of a fucking desert. It's so dumb. It just, I almost turned off the movie at that point because I was waiting. I was trying to be patient.
Which would have been difficult when we were all watching it together.
No,
so
it's not the first time I've done that. And then Robert Carlyle we spoke about when we did Ravenous. So I actually like him. I think he's insane. But we had trouble kind of coming up with movies that we liked him in, other than Trainspotting.
Well, yeah. I mean, Robert Carlyle is just, I think, is a presence. He's one of those actors who shows up and like, oh, it's Robert Carlyle.
And then Sophie Marceau, just quickly, is your classic European actress. Started modeling, got into acting, did some theater, released a CD, directed. I think like Europe and Asia has got this thing where everybody's kind of, to be a celebrity, you got to
like,
touch everything, right?
Oh my gosh, from Run Lola Run. Franco Potente,
well, I was thinking more like Hong Kong cinema,
music.
Where every single one of those like hot guys from that era, like Andy Lau, and like from the 80s, they're like all mega million CD selling. Like it's just weird to think
Didn't
about.
Jackie Chan release an album?
Of course, you have to.
Yeah, isn't he like classically trained in the Peking opera?
Probably.
Well, I think he must come from that era because he wasn't originally. He was in originally an acrobat school for theater, right? Before he got super ripped and could bend his body any way he wanted, in any position he wanted.
This podcast is turning X-rated.
Speaking quickly of Pierce Brosnan and Jackie Chan, The Foreigner is an amazing movie. If you haven't seen it, it's on Canadian Netflix. I don't know about the US, but if you want to see Jackie Chan as an old man, John Wicking people and not being funny, and beating the shit out of Pierce Brosnan, you should watch that movie. It's a good one.
Right.
Yeah.
You had me at beat up Pierce Brosnan. I just want to talk about the writing team here. So the story is by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, written by Neil Purvis, Robert Wade, and Bruce Firestein, of course, based on the characters of Ian Fleming. This has basically been the writing team since this movie. So they were actually writing on, some of them wrote for GoldenEye, or one of them wrote for GoldenEye, I think. But from this movie onward, they have written every single Bond film, for the good and the bad. Whether you liked the movie or didn't like the Bond movie from the last little bit, it's because of these guys. They've also written a bunch of the video games too. So if you like any of the James Bond video games, it's these people as well.
It's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? That you can have the same pair writing and have such strange tonal differences. It's hard to understand. Maybe it's the 9/11 thing and everybody just got more dour, so it became easier to write tragedy instead of this, campy stuff. But they did write Johnny English, so I don't know.
I was going to say, and they wrote Johnny English. It's a weird, anyways, it's super weird. I mean, it's not writing, but it's kind of like my reaction to George Miller, the director George Miller, who's like, does all the Mad Max films and also Babe, Pig in the City.
He did
It's
Babe?
like,
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No, he did Babe, Pig in the City.
Part 2.
And he was a producer on Babe,
Yeah.
and he was one of the writers on the original film.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it's like, how does that work? Anyways, it's interesting to see people's careers. I want to talk more about Michael Apted, who directed this movie, because Well, Kyle, do you know who Michael Apted is? I'm assuming you do.
Yeah, he's usually a documentary filmmaker is the thing.
Yeah, he is. He's a British documentary. The biggest thing that you may have seen from him is the 7-Up series. The guy who's been making every 7 years, following the same people. I think they're up to 56 years old.
Yeah.
I think it was the last one. 56 Up was the last one that came out a few years ago. So literally over since the 60s, actually since James Bond, since the 60s, he's been making these documentary films following the same people. The other two fiction films that people might know are Coal Miner's Daughter and Gorillas in the Mist. He directed those two as well. Unless you're a big Ray Donovan fan, because he's directed 2 episodes of Ray Donovan. So the Ray Donaheads out there, I guess, are really excited about that factoid.
If you say one bad thing about Ray Donovan, I will end you.
This is my thing. I'm going to make a very bold statement here, and I'm going to make enemies. I don't think he was the best person to direct this film for many reasons. For that, I don't think he was up to the challenge necessarily of directing the action sequences in much the same way as I get up on my high horse when Kenneth Branagh is asked to direct action sequences, because I don't think he can do it. Mm-hmm. He's great at Shakespeare, but man, trying directing an action film is like, please don't anymore, because you don't know how to do it. That's my opinion.
His remake of Murder on the Orient Express was also tedious.
I liked it. It's very old-fashioned and
well, the original is way better. It still holds up.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think it's made with a sort of cozy demeanor that I enjoyed.
I will say this: Artemis Fowl is certainly not good.
I heard that's awful.
So don't watch that movie.
Wait, is that directed by Kenneth Branagh?
It sure is.
Good.
Yeah. Didn't that get dumped on Disney Plus?
Yes.
It got dumped on Disney Plus, and I wasted an hour and a half of my time watching it. Yes. I watch it only so that you'll have visual nightmares of Josh Gad unhinging his jaw.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
Why are you kink shaming me?
It's in a kid's film and it's nightmare inducing. Anyways, this is not about Artemis Fowl. We're not going to talk about
Isn't
that. Isn't
Judi Dench in that movie?
She is, okay. Yes. And talks like Christian Bale Batman.
Good.
So, I mean,
that's what you want.
It is a choice, definitely, of a movie. Okay, so that is some background of what's going on in this movie. And, usually we end by asking this question, but I actually want to start by asking this question. Kyle, how culturally relevant do you think this film still is?
I think it's very culturally relevant, actually. I can't trace the origins, and maybe this is just speaking retrospectively as my own, personal politics continue to develop and change and evolve and whatnot. But it is a film basically where, for me at least, at the end I was like, oh, the villain was right. It's like she had some things to say. She had some points.
Sure.
I think in spite of its sort of messy relationship to the Cold War, I think the aftermath of the Cold War and the aftermath of 9/11, actually, which is why I think it would make a good double feature with Casino Royale, I think it ends up making it a very relevant film.
How about you, Dave?
I can't see that at all. No, and maybe I got mired in just its trappings, but I couldn't even understand the idea of stealing decommissioned nuclear warheads and trying to blow up Istanbul to make a statement about a woman's hereditary right to own an oil field. And the whole thing was a mess. I do like the idea that we had a villainess for the first time in a long time, so just as a concept. I thought Sophie Marceau was great in it, playing sort of both sides in a 1990s way. It's been done in a much more creepy way, recently by a lot of actors. But I can't. Everything about this movie is a joke to me. The fact that you have James Bond is the only person that can aim a gun. The fact that you have these weird helicopters that chop wood that are flown into a dock for just the purpose of chopping up a car. There's nothing about this movie that ages well. I
don't
know.
It disappointing. Isn't that James Bond though? The ridiculousness of it to a certain degree is
isn't that apologetic though? I mean, I get it.
I guess, but I mean, we start off this franchise, well, early in the franchise at least, about a guy who covers people in gold to asphyxiate them.
Sure.
I mean, these are not your normal run of the mill villains. And my personal feeling is James Bond is always. I shouldn't say that always the best. James Bond is mostly, or very often the best, when James Bond is your center, and then the villain is wackadoo. I love it when they're just wild and crazy. That's my favorite.
But isn't that kind of what we're talking about? I mean, if this had been more of a cartoon, and it's not trying to take itself nearly as seriously as it tried to do, you can get this escapist world of film where I could just unplug, not think about any kind of relevance to my life, the geopolitical thing, like social dynamics, and I could just lay down with my mouth gaping open, drooling into my popcorn, and just be, entertained. But this movie, like all of we've complained about post 9/11 cinema in general. People don't seem to be allowed to do that, and this movie doesn't have the sort of excuse of having gone through such a massive world event in its direct writing time. I don't think it can find a tone. It's cartoonish, but it's also trying to be too serious.
I don't disagree that this ends up being more emblematic of Pierce Brosnan's cycle more generally, maybe with the exception of Goldeneye, in this like desire to find the correct tone, because I think the Bond franchise overall has always sort of straddled this line between cartoonish superhero escapism and real world politics and trying to marry the two. And then I think what Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Isn't Enough, and Less So Die Another Day indicates is, as action blockbusters more broadly were changing their form, that's prompted the James Bond franchise to do the same. But there was a confusion with these films in terms of being able to balance the tone of contemporary action cinema and its cartoonishness and its mining from real world politics. I think what fascinates me is that this seems like the first step in James Bond sort of engaging with like somewhat post or anti-colonial narratives, in the sense that if we're spoiling here, Electric King's desire to steal these nuclear warheads, to blow up Turkey, to assert her relationship with oil in Azerbaijan, ends up being this, I think, suggestion with regards to the way in which oil is exploited and abused substance or resource that threatens the local people, as well as continually funds sort of imperialist oil interests in the UK and around the world.
I did think that was interesting, the idea that people who control oil kind of control the money, at least definitely in that region, but more broadly the world. I don't think that would have been necessarily like eye-opening during the time, but I think that is interesting that the James Bond franchise of all things are like focusing on that and not going to like a moon base or like someone's trying to steal gold or whatever. It's like, no, this is kind of put into the real world. I do agree with you, Dave, though, very strongly that this movie has a hard time trying to figure out what tone it wants to settle on. But I think I'm coming at it from an opposite end from you. I think it actually does work the best when it tries to ground itself and then it tries to button it with a joke every single time. It's like, you don't need that in this scene. Like, for instance, the part that did work for me, he's in the like underwater, like skidoo thing, and like he fixes his tie. It's like, that's all you really need, because you're telling story through action beats. And I think that works incredibly well. When he has to do his like little one-liners, I'm like, this is starting to feel tired. You don't have to button every scene with this. You can just let it flow naturally. And I think they did finally figure out how to do that with, again, we bring him up constantly, I guess, in this episode. But when Daniel Craig comes on, he's able to do that naturally through scenes and not have to be like, I'm telling a joke now and tell a joke. And then it just feels weird with the tone.
I don't have the research background on this, but do you think, Kyle, that there's something to be said about the writing of Bond movies being influenced by being part of culture instead of trying to be culture forming? So in other words, if you're in the 60s, you're in the middle of the Cold War, I can't imagine people are trying to write stories for Bond that are going to change people's minds about their perspective of the Cold War. But I think in the 90s, like you kind of brought up, without a monolithic sort of enemy, now the writers are tasked with inventing real-world bad guys. And they're still pulling by their influence, but we kind of live in this culture too, where it's just before the dawn of social media, but there's something about kind of blame culture, right? I mean, the 80s were definitely, and the 90s were definitely seeing the political influence of oil, and, now it's going to be water. Or, in your country, in the States, who knows, it's probably going to be on fire in another month. But I think, looking at this movie and bringing up this idea of what was it, like 5 pipelines are owned by the Russians, and this is the one that's going to free Europe. It's a little childish, so there's an attempt to kind of to contextualize it in something that these two writers are maybe worried about or read in a headline, but it doesn't have that much underneath it. We don't if we're going to go the other way, I need a movie to explain a little bit of it instead of the presumption that, if M says it, then we need to be worried about it. It's something that I couldn't grip onto. Whereas when I watch old spy movies, they often bring up like an East German or a neo-Nazi something, or the communist threat of the robotic Soviet peoples, right? But like in a cartoonish sense, they could all be one thing. It's just a non-human entity, and we're going to push back against it. Now things are in this movie in particular, it's so muddled. I mean, Robert Carlyle, was he supposed to be German or Russian? And I couldn't even understand him. Why was he in this movie? I don't understand why he had such a prominent, never mind the 3D graphics, which are fucking ridiculous, but why is he in this movie?
Well, he's the red herring of the movie, right?
Yes, he's
being built up to be the main villain, but he actually isn't.
And that's the thing. They build this Bond villain into him. Bullets slowly kill him, can't feel pain, and then it's a waste of time.
I do think Renard is an unnecessary part of the film. If they focus more on Electra King, I think the film would be stronger. But I sort of understand why you needed a red herring as a sort of like someone to convert her. Because I think her ultimate goal is to force MI6 to confront its own sins in a way. Not only in the fact that they abandoned her when she had been kidnapped, but I think the abandonment then served as a jumping off point for her to understand the broader context of how they function in the world as super policemen, basically. And I understand your point in terms of James Bond functioning better when there are real or more tangible villains to draw from as opposed to the invention of others, as it were. Even though this oil plot does have some sort of basis in reality, in terms of the oil that flows through Azerbaijan and whatnot, and the way that it was being used by the British government. I understand that because there is a lack of clarity there, and a lack of clarity in terms of being able to connect that for an audience perspective, being able to connect that to something more tangible or more concrete that ends up sort of undermining the film's ambitions in terms of connecting James Bond to broader post-colonialist narratives.
To be just revisionist, if they had a scene near the beginning where someone complains about the cost of their gas as they're filling up their car, I mean, just one point. And then when it comes back, you're like, oh, well, it's because the Russians have 5 pipelines and we really need this lady to give us the one. I'll just quickly, too, the only point I almost got excited for this movie is when I convinced myself that Electra King had never had Stockholm Syndrome and was actually this puppet master. And then they fucking blew that up, too. And I was just like, I don't care. I don't care.
Well, talking about Carrie, and Kyle, what do you think works the best in this movie?
Electra King. I think she's an incredible villain. I think her motivations are really fascinating to me. I think her performance is really interesting. I figured out last night, because I rewatched it with y'all as well as last night.
The narrative.
Because I like to do things multiple times. I'm a little bit of a masochist in that way. But I figured out the reason why she has that accent and why she is made up in the way that she is. Because she is exoticized in a manner that she looks vaguely East Asian. She looks like she could be mixed race or Hapa or something. And that ends up being because of her lineage, her mother's lineage in Azerbaijan and Turkey and whatnot, which I thought was really interesting. And I like that her relationship to Renard ends up fueling this really fascinating trauma narrative in terms of her relationship, not only her relationship to Renard, but also her relationship to MI6 and M, and this sort of clash between the paternal and the maternal, and her father as well. This the name, the character's name obviously invites sort of Freudian Electra complex readings,
I know, Dave, that you don't like most of this, but was there anything that worked for you at all?
I think paragliding terrorists who drop bombs on each other, that was very, it was terrible. I mean, I'll agree on this. I thought Sophie Marceau was great in it. I think that she took the shit material she was given and really filled that character with the nuance of being both, a victim and a villain. I think that might be it. I mean, Pierce Brosnan's he's actually a pretty good actor. So there are a couple of moments where he can show some of the range, where he can go from cool and calculated to completely distraught. But it's placed in a junky way where it's so random. Like even the injury he sustains seems to only bother him at key plot points. But then otherwise he's flipping, doing backflips, wrestling guys to the ground. And then once it's important to the story, he'll go down in pain. That doesn't give an actor a lot of grounding to kind of build something into a movie. So he's kind of having to...
I will say, sorry to cut you off, is I like that they introduced that and they used it. But I think that, again, it's one of those things that could have been used to more effect. To like really be hampering him in that final scene. Like, I cannot physically like move my arm. So how do I figure this out?
And how fascinating it is, I mean, not to overplay Skyfall, but that the same writing team took a Daniel Craig actor and kind of looked at this movie likely and said, here are the 17,000 things we fucked up on. Let's rebuild, like you guys are talking about, these core elements that actually make sense. We'll lose Electra King because it's such a joke, but we'll bring in Javier Bardem with a very similar sort of contextual thing, right? Where he's upset at his mother for abandoning him, even though he's a super spy. And Daniel Craig's, I mean, I read somewhere about this, middle life crisis Bond where he's falling apart. It's just interesting when we discovered it's the same writing team. It goes to reinforce my belief that even the writers don't like this movie. Why rehash it so directly? You don't need to, but they brought the exact same story back. Including the shoulder injury and like being abandoned by like the whole thing plays. It's very weird.
Well, if we ever talk about the year 2012 or whenever Skyfall came out, we'll talk about that movie more.
Okay.
But...
and then I don't know. I actually disagree. I didn't like the beginning. I don't like the idea of having a gun that's actually a bomb. I thought that was really corny. And having this beautiful woman with, what was her name? It was like on a top. And so I just found myself shaking my head the whole way through.
Well, I wrote down some notes while I was watching this, so maybe we can go through some of these things just to fill out the conversation a little bit more.
I'm just shocked you can write.
So this would have been Desmond Llewellyn's last time as Q, but not really a fun fact. I don't know why I phrase it that way. He did not pass away by old age. He died in a car accident. Did you know that?
Fun fact. Wow.
So he was supposed, well, I was going to say he was supposed to be in the next Bond film, but like passed away right before it started filming. So, which is interesting because it really does feel like they're using John Cleese to take over for him eventually. And I am on record as saying I normally like John Cleese. I don't know if he really works in this movie that much, but
he does not.
I keep harping on this, and I know someone's going to eventually push back on me on this. This happened very much in like the later Roger Moore films where I felt like the age difference between him and the main woman actress is getting like way too big. I'm like, I don't think this is cool anymore. It's kind of the same thing here with Brosnan and Richards. Like he's 47, she's 28. So like almost 20 years difference. I mean, I don't know if it really is a huge deal, but it's like, I don't know. It just feels weird to me that James Bond always can be like aging and the girls always have to be in like their mid 20s. I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that necessarily.
That's part of the shtick that doesn't hold up anymore. I mean, why cast Denise Richards?
Okay, I want to go to bat for Denise Richards in this film.
Sure, do it.
I think she's fine. I think like it's almost, I think her casting in this film is almost ironic in the sense that she, for most of her career, has been typecast as like a vapid, beautiful, but kind of stupid character. She kind of bimbo-esque. I do think it's somewhat of a meta casting choice to put her in the role as a nuclear physicist. And I think it gives her also a fun opportunity to make fun of it on 30 Rock. I think she's fine in the role. I think she does what she needs to do. She's like the exposition girl. That sounds more condescending than I intended. She's the exposition character. And that's fine. I don't think she is nearly as bad as her reputation in this film's legacy suggests. She's definitely not the worst Bond woman in the franchise. And she has more to do than a lot of them, actually. And she asserts that quite a bit. So I think she's fine. I don't think she's perfect by any means, but I think she is totally functional in the film.
Mm-hmm. So take that, Dave.
Yeah, I'm just trying not to.
You jerk.
I'm trying not to push back in a. I don't think I like movies that she acts in.
I think that's your own baggage coming in, Dave.
That's my life is baggage. If you're gonna give a female character a little bit of, like you said, more lines, more importance to the plot, that you can't, as we saw in later iterations of Bond, they were still an age gap, but at least they had a little bit of depth, even with the casting. All the female counterparts in the recent Bonds have tried to change that. So maybe this was a watershed moment. I don't know. They're not doing it that successful. They're losing to Mission Impossible and Fast and the Furious now in terms of cultural relevance.
Well, that's what I mean. Like nowadays, there's so many different franchises that Bond has to compete against. Like it's trying to, I think it has found its niche still, but it definitely took a bit to react to, yes, Jason Bourne, but yes, Fast and the Furious. Now there's Marvel films. There's all these other influences that it's kind of trying to compete against. Definitely, I know you, Kyle, have watched many of the James Bond films. Where does this fall for you? Is this top of the list, bottom of the list, middle of the pack? Where does this fall
There's
in
so many
your
films?
Your list?
You're asking a pretty hard question here.
I know.
Yeah, I have 24. If you're not counting the unofficial Bond films,
right.
I would say that this is pretty middle. I like it more and more each time I watch it. I would say that's sort of maybe bottom top 10 or very high top or very middle top 20.
I feel like we
somewhere
should
around 10 or 11.
I feel like we should hashtag this episode bottom top 10. That's pretty good. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I kind of agree with you, Kyle, because I think this is pretty middle of the road. I don't even think this is the worst Pierce Brosnan James Bond film. So I don't think this is the absolute worst of the Bond films. And but I also am pretty negative about most of the Roger Moore stuff. So but that's my own baggage coming into it. I think Octopussy is almost unwatchable, and you've heard it here first. So, how about you, Dave? Do you have a feeling where you would put this or slot this in other James Bond films you've seen?
I do often wonder where I'd slot in James Bond. No, I'm not sure. I mean, I really didn't like watching this movie. I didn't connect to it at all. Is it the worst James Bond experience I've ever had? No, you're right. I mean, at least 2 other Pierce Brosnan movies were probably worse than this one. And there's a whole pantheon of other older movies that I haven't rewatched in probably 30 years. So I don't really have a say within the 24 movie spectrum. Would I watch this movie again? Absolutely not. Would I concede that this thing has any relevance in the world today? Just to be disagreeable, I don't think so. So I just don't like this movie. I can't do a comparative analysis with the rest of the Bond movies I seem to remember watching, but I don't know if it would be bottom top 10 for me. I think it might be bottom 10.
Would it be a top bottom 10?
We could we could go middle bottom and then the top.
Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, depends on which night we're talking about.
So it'd be verse.
I don't mind bottoming.
Damn it.
We're done here.
The machine has asked us to wrap up, but I do want to ask this because I love James Bond as a franchise so much. Of course, it's still going on. There was supposed to be a James Bond movie that came out this year and had to be pushed back till 2021. Can I just tell you my little fan theory that I know is going to be proven wrong, but I want to be proven right so bad? It's No Time to Die is what the latest James Bond film is going to be called.
They're going to kill him.
I think they're going to kill off Daniel Craig in the movie is my little pet theory that's going to happen. But I don't know. Where do you think you want to go from here? I'm not interested in who you think is going to be James Bond next, but do you think it's going to try and reinvent itself after Craig is gone? Because presumably this is his last film, although he said that last time too. So who knows?
I'm curious as to whether they'll kill him in the film. I neither confirm nor deny, disagree or agree with that assertion. I do think it will need to reinvent itself. It has to, just by nature of cyclical tenures and whether Craig returns or not and whatnot, but also just in terms of the temperature of blockbuster filmmaking, because I think it's becoming more and more cognizant that it is unable to keep up with other franchises, not in a bad way necessarily, but there are too many IP.
They're just pumping stuff out,
that are churning things out in like a very industrial, complex way. And I think it needs to reevaluate what they want James Bond to say. And I think his growing obsolescence and the fact that they're sort of like asserting that more and more, especially in Spectre, where they basically argue that like James Bond should die. We have no reason to have field agents like him anymore. And also like he's the ghost of British imperialism, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so I kind of wonder if they're going to do a period piece next. I wonder if they're going to go retro. I would not be opposed.
That's interesting.
To that.
That's actually a really interesting idea. Yeah. Go basically set it back in the 60s again and go from there. That's an interesting thing. Dave, do you have any ideas about this? Like, or wants, I guess, from where the James Bond franchise goes to?
No, not particularly. It was interesting listening to you guys. Like, this is offensive sounding, fanboy a little bit and separating the Bond legacy from industrial movie making. I mean, I think they are one of the founding backbones of this idea of serializing movies and spitting out stars to keep.
I will say though, but it wasn't until like the Craig ones where they tried to even attempt continuity. Like the other ones are not really trying to do that in a way. Sometimes they do, but not really.
Right.
Certainly,
they're fairly self-contained.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can't remember. No, you're right. Yeah, I think the next Pierce Brosnan movie, this is the one where he's in a prison camp, right, to start the movie.
Yes,
so it doesn't make sense. Off, right? Okay.
The one where the villain is a North Korean person who has surgery to make himself white.
Oh, who incidentally was in the first Fast and the Furious.
Yes, he was.
Yeah, I don't know. When I look at stuff like this, and we were just off air, we were talking about Star Wars and Star Trek. I think we're about to see like this unfortunate everything being referenced to COVID, but the movie industry is due for a breaking point. I think the idea of making these $150 million films will be threatened because we don't know. Even if this thing dies out, there will be another. I'm sorry, listeners, there will be another pandemic in the future. We've shown that it's viable. So, do people gamble this amount of money to put on a single star to blow shit up? Even if it's a period piece like we saw with I haven't watched them, but like Kingsman and stuff, I think they're doing the similar thing where they're going back in time, just to get a third or fourth movie out. I mean, putting on a period piece at this level to blow shit up, that's a very elaborate process, right? If we want Bond to continue, I think I agree with you, Kyle. I think they have to go that way. I think we can't continue making a present Bond anymore. And we talked a little bit about grounding things in reality. Reality now is so fucked up that you can't ground it on anything because, I mean, there's no ground. Jesus, if you actually watch the news cycle, you'd go schizophrenic. It's a weird place we're existing in now. So to write a spy novel set in the 2020s, it's a joke.
So you basically want the next Bond film to be a Zoom call and him
it
just
will
trying to
be,
figure it
but
out.
I wouldn't be sad if I would be sad if Daniel Craig as Bond dies because, it'd be emotional. But I wouldn't be sad if they did that and they just walked away. The Broccolis can't because they're rich and they won't let that money go away.
Burn them out.
But
I guess I think what my subtle idea behind that is there was this long time fan theory, which was proven wrong multiple times. Let me tell you that. But I mean, a long-term fan theory that like, James Bond was actually just a moniker and it was never actually his real name. And so every James Bond actor you saw was him just taking up the mantle because the previous one had died or whatever. I actually kind of think that they should maybe lean into that of him. He does definitively die. Next mantle takes up and then goes from there. But I don't know.
You know what can of worms that brings up? Like they're talking a couple years about Idris and stuff is apologetic filmmaking and how that doesn't catch on. Like as much as liberal people would love to see the idea of a Black Bond, that should just be a new franchise. Like if you're going to do...
Yes, I totally agree.
Right?
Totally
agree. Like a female... like a awesome woman of color who's kicking everyone's ass. That should be its own project.
I mean, Charlize Theron is making a career of being like an ass-kicking woman in her films. A lot of women
are, right?
Yeah. I think the idea of a like non-white or non-male James Bond is very much a new liberal fantasy that, like, if you put marginalized bodies in these institutions that are capable and responsible for genocide, that it automatically makes it all better. I think, if anything, the franchise ever wants to really confront that on a really tactile or material level, changing the casting is not the way to do it.
Having just watched Three Kings, just quickly on Kyle's theory.
Wait, no, we haven't watched it yet.
Thinking about watching Three Kings, it would be interesting if there's a moment in Three Kings where they are trying to contextualize both sides of the enemy hero thing, and that's the story in Die Tomorrow, whatever the next Die.
No Time to Die?
No Time to Die. That's how they can frame the death of Bond, where you actually empathize with the person who kills him. That would be writing,
really
right?
Yeah.
But that's not going to happen. Yeah. That would be.
Well, yeah, that takes you have to walk a very fine line to hit that right. Kyle, the machine makes us rate every movie we watch. I feel so bad when we have guests on because your rating doesn't matter, but I'm going to ask it to you anyways. Out of 5, what would you rate this movie?
3.5, 4.
Sorry, 3.5, 4? Or 2.5? 3.5 to a 4?
3.5.
Okay.
Dave, what would you rate this movie?
I'm gonna. My brain is just going 1. Yeah, I'm gonna go with my heart then and just say, point. No, I think I'll stay with a 1. I didn't like this movie at all.
Like I said, I'm right there in the center. I'm curious if I do rewatch this. I will probably eventually rewatch this movie, to be perfectly frank, because I rewatch movies all the time. I'm giving it a 2.5, literally like right in the middle of the pack here for me, which means that averages to 1.75.
It's another pretty big. I mean, it's not as egregious as South Park, but another movie we didn't see eye to eye. And if we do any supplemental feature about convincing each other we're wrong, we'll get Kyle to come back and with a stronger stick and just beat our heads over until I concede another half point or something. But
I'll pour caviar down your throat.
That scene was fuck.
It's so interesting doing this show with you, Dave, because we average our scores together, and then I look at our list. I'm like, man, I would reorder this list. It was my list. Anyway, so entering our list at number 28 is The World Is Not Enough.
Seems a bit low, but that's okay. Because
it does seem a little bit low, but that's your fault.
Yeah, Kyle, we've watched a lot of garbage. Yeah.
Before we find out what we're going to be watching next week, Kyle, if people wanted to stay in contact with you and find out what you're writing online, how can they do that?
You can find me online on Twitter at Tylekurner, with Tylekurner. Just a spoonerism of my name because I'm an extremely creative person. And you can find some of my writing across the internet at Paste Magazine, New York Times, and Slate and GQ, and on my website, tylekurner.com.
Thank you so much again for doing this. This was really great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this was, I knew we were going to have a great conversation, so this turned out really well for me. Let's find out what we're watching next week. I'm going to push this button. Oh, I mean, Dave, you must have had this just on the mind randomly. Next week, we're going to be watching Three Kings.
Whoa, that's amazing. I'm a savant. I'm a psychic.
Yeah.
I'm not an idiot.
All right. So I guess, Dave, can you just take my new profile photo? How should I stand? How if I pretend to be just a nuclear physicist? Just tell me how to pose myself.
Well, you're wearing too many clothes, first of all, because everybody knows for the radiation, you should be naked. Yeah. Secondly, we're gonna have to work on the chest hair. It's a problem.
Should I not have shaved it into Pierce Brosnan's face? Is that weird? Or
I think it's genius. Frankly, it looks great.